Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be taking a look at all the different types of drafts, contests, and tournaments that are offered for the 2024 NFL season in terms of best ball drafts. So we're going to be taking a look at all the major websites that offer best ball, taking a look at the different types of contests that they offer, and giving you the down low on those types of contests and the strategies that you need to succeed in order to draft the best team possible for these contests. So whether you are a beginner or an experienced best ball player, this episode is hopefully going to help you keep up with all the different types of contests that are available to you and give you what you need to know in order to draft the best team possible in those contests. Because even with me playing best ball for a few years now, it's even getting hard for me to keep up on all the different types of contests that are offered. But by doing a little bit of research, by kind of breaking down what should end up happening in these contests, you can kind of get all the information you need to know in order to go into the draft with the most information possible. Now, before we continue, I do want to mention that if you are looking to begin playing best ball on any of these sites, maybe you've played on Underdog before, maybe you want to try DraftKings, maybe you've played on DraftKings before, maybe you want to try Drafters. I have promo codes available for all three sites. Some of them are available in the description to this YouTube video as well as to this audio episode. So check there if you would like those promo codes. If not, reach out to me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I would be more than happy to provide you with the promo codes that way you can get the best deposit match possible for all these websites. We also have a blanket site, signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks, that has all the best promo codes and deals available for most of these sites, in addition to every online sports book that's available, and it syncs to your location for your state as well. So if you need a promo code for anything, head to signupexpert.com/Mike's Picks, check out the description, or just reach out to me directly on Twitter, and I'd be more than happy to help you out and get you started on any of these websites. Also, if you're interested in any of the best ball content that we've done so far this summer, we've already done a strategies and basics episode. We have done a live draft. We have done a late round targets episode. If you're interested in any of that, if you're watching on YouTube, check out the playlist. All of our best ball content for the 2024 season is going to be in that one playlist. And also, while you're here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way you can be with us for the rest of the PGA Tour season. The Open Championship is coming out soon. And then also, when we start college football season, we're going to have weekly content for college football and NFL as well. We also have an episode on college football best ball, so check that out if you are interested in that also. All right, let's go ahead and end the introduction there, and let's go ahead and dive into all of the contests that we need to talk about. All right, so first off, let's go ahead and talk about the three major best ball sites that are out there. So the first three that most people play on, they're the most popular, are DraftKings, Drafters, and Underdog. Underdog are kind of like the pioneers in this space. A lot of content that is out there right now is geared towards Underdog drafts because they are kind of the leaders in the business. But there are differences between the three websites. DraftKings offers 20 full rounds with full PPR scoring, and DraftKings also offers bonus points, which we're going to get into a little bit later. Drafters also 20 rounds, full PPR scoring, and then they also offer cumulative scoring throughout the season, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Basically, when you enter a Drafters tournament, your entry is scored the entirety of the season, weeks 1 through 17, as opposed to having playoffs. Underdog, which are kind of like I said, the pioneers of it, the ones that most people are going to talk about, are 18 rounds, half PPR, and Underdog offers a ton of different contest styles, of which we are going to break down every single one of them here on this episode. But kind of the bones and the core of best ball is the same on all of these sites. You are still going to be looking to start one quarterback, two running backs, three receivers, and a tight end every week. There are no ads, drops, free agents, trades, any of that. And stacking is still going to be one of the in vogue strategies, no matter what site you're playing on, no matter what format you're playing in. Now, let's go and talk about the difference between if a site has 20 rounds like DraftKings or Drafters, or 18 rounds like on Underdog. So in the simplest form, having 20 rounds, to me, makes it the easiest to have three quarterbacks and or three tight ends on your roster. And that is because you're still starting the same amount of players in your lineup. You're still only starting two running backs, three wide receivers, a flex, and a tight end. So what that means is this. If 5 running backs and 8 wide receivers, which is kind of the norm on Underdog for 18 rounds, is enough for an 18-round team, then it's very easy to just say, hey, I still have enough running backs and receivers if I go 5 and 8, and then I have 3 quarterbacks and 3 tight ends, and then we even get an additional pick after that. So 20-round drafts, to me, make 3 quarterback builds and or 3 tight end builds a lot more viable, a lot more easy to pick up. To me, 20 rounds also makes handcuffing your running back significantly easier. So if you're not familiar with the term, handcuffing a running back means that you draft a team's starting running back and then draft their backup. Now, handcuffing in the truest sense is like drafting like a full backup. So like the best example of this would be right now. Let's go with Atlanta, Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. The way that these two backs are projected to be used is that Bijan is projected to be the starter and he will play all 3 downs. And then Tyler Algier will come in occasionally to spell him. Tyler Algier is not like a pass catching back like an Austin Eckler, Brian Robinson type situation. He's a guy that is purely Bijan Robinson's backup and will play the full allotment of snaps if an injury were to ever happen to Bijan Robinson. So handcuffing is significantly easier in a 20-round draft because you have those 2 extra picks, right? So maybe, you can use an extra running back pick on getting your guys handcuffed and basically saying, hey, if I'm able to get Bijan and then later I'm able to get Tyler Algier, then I'm going to have 17 weeks where Falcons starting running back is going to be a guy that can end up being in my starting lineup each and every week. Now, to me, also 20 rounds makes stacking your quarterbacks with your wide receivers significantly easier. I'm going to assume that you know what stacking means. If you have not, go back and watch our initial best ball strategies video. Shameless self-promotion there. But stacking basically is one of the necessities of best ball, and it's so much easier when you have 20 rounds because, simply put, there's just more players in your player pool. So even if you draft, say, Kyler Murray, and you miss out on Marvin Harrison Jr. and you miss out on Trey McBride, then there's going to be plenty of opportunities at the back end of the draft to get a Zay Jones or a Michael Wilson or a Greg Dortch. There's just a lot of opportunities to get a quarterback's wide receiver 2, 3, and 4 at the very end of a draft, as opposed to, when it's 18 rounds and maybe these guys don't even end up being on your radar by the end of the draft. Now, in either event, whether you're playing a 20-round draft like on DraftKings or Drafters or an 18-round draft on Underdog, then most of your draft capital should be devoted to the wide receiver position. If you end a draft and you don't have more wide receivers than any other position, unless you're playing like a super flex draft, which are not really in vogue right now, then I would think that's not really a winning formula. You need to be devoting a ton of capital to the wide receiver position on your team. Now, let's also talk about this difference. So we mentioned already the difference between DraftKings, Drafters, and Underdog. Well, DraftKings and Drafters have full PPR. Underdog has half PPR. Quick side note, FanDuel offers a very limited best ball product. They also offer half PPR. They are currently only offering like private time-locked drafts that aren't in a tournament form. They're just season-long cumulative scoring with just 12 people or 10 people or even 6 people. So FanDuel is a little bit different, but in terms of the fact that not every draft is with 12 players, but DraftKings or FanDuel is half PPR if you were ever to do a draft on FanDuel. Now, to the difference. So full PPR, like on DraftKings and Drafters, adds value to wide receivers and volume-based tight ends. What this means is if you have a guy like a Devontae Smith who goes for 8 catches for 120 yards, then those 8 catches are going to count for 8 points on DraftKings as opposed to 4 points on Underdog. Volume-based tight ends also, I think, is going to add value to that as well, because when we talk about the tight end position, there's tight ends that are going to get sizable volume, like a Dalton Kincaid or like a Mark Andrews, or as opposed to the tight ends that you're drafting near the end of the draft where you just kind of hope that they fall into the end zone, right? Well, volume-based tight ends will see a boost for this because a tight end that catches 5 passes is going to get 5 points for those as opposed to 2.5, whereas the tight end that just falls into the end zone gets 6 points for a touchdown, and the guy that gets more volume can end up catching up to him in the long run because of the amount of catches that they get, even if they don't end up scoring a touchdown. Full PPR scoring also adds value to pass-catching running backs because, simply put, if you're going to be in there, you're going to catch 6 passes. The difference in that is going to be 3 points over the course of one game. And then, over the course of a season, that adds up. So pass-catching running backs get a little bit of a boost. Half PPR scoring, like on Underdog, adds value to quarterbacks, in my opinion. And this is because half PPR scoring keeps the general point totals of running backs and wide receivers further down. So that way, relative to their quarterback counterparts, they're scoring less points week in and week out. Quick side note, we mentioned Superflex leagues slightly earlier. If you play a Superflex league, which Underdog has done one already, and they might come back with one before the summer is over, Superflex leagues prioritize the quarterback because you get to start a quarterback in the superflex spot. So you can end up starting 2 quarterbacks. So basically, quarterbacks end up shooting up the draft board in superflex, and wide receivers and running backs shoot down the draft board in superflex because you have the option of starting 2 quarterbacks. And guess what? Quarterbacks, because of half PPR scoring, are the ones that are scoring more points week in and week out. So that is why superflex will highly prioritize the value of the quarterback. Now, in full PPR formats, I think that receivers should shoot up the draft board in this format simply because they're going to end up generally scoring more points than running backs because of getting that full point per reception. But looking at the ADPs on DraftKings, Drafters, and Underdog right now, it's actually a different story. Underdog is where the receivers are having the highest ADP, which is slightly counterintuitive to the format that's offered between the 3 websites. But I think that that's because you're seeing a different type of drafter on Underdog as opposed to the other 3 or the other 2 websites. And we're going to talk a little bit more on that slightly later. Now, last big difference between the websites is DraftKings' bonus points. So DraftKings offers bonus points for a player in any given week if they hit a few requirements. They offer 3 bonus points for either a 300-yard passer, a 100-yard rusher, or a 100-yard receiver in a single game. What this does is this boosts pocket passing quarterbacks because it is a lot easier for a quarterback to pass for 300 yards than it is for a quarterback to run for 100 yards. Even the most prolific rushing quarterbacks like Lamar Jackson and Anthony Richardson don't often hit the 100-yard marker. Pocket passing quarterbacks can very easily hit the 300-yard marker in a single game. Big play wide receivers also get a boost for the 100-yard bonus. And this is because if you have a receiver such as a Tyreek Hill, maybe he's not a good example because he's also quite good at football. So let's go with, say, Mike Williams of the New York Jets. If he catches 1 pass for 70 yards, well, then now he only needs 30 more yards the rest of the game in order to reach his 100-yard bonus. So big play wide receivers, even if they have limited volume, can get there in terms of value if they're able to get that 100-yard bonus. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick break right there, and then we're going to come back and talk about all the different types of contests that are open. All right, so now that we know the differences between all the websites and all their quirks, let's talk about the individual contests and their quirks. So the first difference is between cumulative scoring and stage playoffs. So cumulative scoring is what you're going to see in drafters tournaments. It's what you're going to see in the FanDuel private leagues that I mentioned earlier. It's also what you would see if you do a private draft on Underdog. You would see cumulative scoring. Cumulative scoring, simply put, counts every single one of your points for your starting lineup weeks 1 through 17, and then adds it up at the end and then awards prizes based off of that. Simple enough, right? Stage playoffs, and that's what I'm going to be referring to them as stage playoffs. That kind of makes the most sense to me to call it a stage. Stage playoffs are going to see a certain number of teams from each draft make it out of the regular season and into the playoffs. The cutoff is usually week 14. And then in week 15, they will play in another small pod. And the top teams out of that pod will make it to week 16. And then you'll be entered in another pod that's randomly assigned. And a number of teams out of that pod will make it to the finals in week 17. Most Underdog tournaments have the stage playoffs. Most DraftKings tournaments have the stage playoffs. Most of these stage playoffs follow a pretty similar format. What I will say, though, is when it comes to the stage playoffs, you can see a number of teams who advance on Underdog and on DraftKings. So you'll know who or how many teams out of how many players in a pod reach week 16 from week 15 and reach week 17 from week 16. To me, that is very important information. Personally, I want to have the best chance of making the final as possible. Long term, the best EV, aka expected value that you can have, is by putting the most teams into a final. Last year, I got 1 team into a final on Underdog, and that paid for my entire season in best ball. And I had numerous other teams that made it to week 16 that was able to generate enough cash from that I profited as a whole on the best ball season in 2023. So What I would like to look at is I like to see the teams that have either very small pods in week 15 and week 16 or advance a very high rate of teams from the pods in week 15 and week 16. So like if it goes regular season ends in week 14 and then week 15 is 1 out of 12, that is giving you a very low percent to make the final because you have a 1 in 12 chance theoretically at making it out of week 15, which then you'll have another whatever 1 in whatever chance to get out of week 16 and make it to the finals. So I like to look for the highest proportion of teams that advance to the final as possible when I do stage playoff contests. Now, Underdog, like I said, most of their tournaments will have stage playoffs. The marathon, which we're going to talk about in a second, and all drafters tournaments feature the cumulative scoring. So do not get that confused. Cumulative scoring is for the marathon and the drafters tournament. Stage playoffs are most Underdog and DraftKings tournaments. Now, the stage playoffs, because most of the prize money is awarded on week 17, there is a big time emphasis on week 17 game stacks in those drafts. And what I mean by this year, let's say the Packers and the Vikings play in week 17, because they do. So if I were to draft a lot of Packers, it would benefit me to have a lot of Vikings in that same team, because if the Packers are scoring a lot of points in week 17 against the Vikings, then it's quite likely that the Vikings are going to have to throw and score points as well to try to match the Packers. So you want to stack your week 17 games so that way maybe you can get a little bit of correlation that if some of your guys are going off, the other guys are going off. Last year, the best example of this was the Lions and Cowboys game, where a lot of players who drafted CeeDee Lamb in the first round made Amon-Ra St. Brown their second pick because the Cowboys and the Lions played in week 17. And this game ended up being a pretty high scoring game where both of those receivers went off. And so you saw a ton of CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown lineups near the top of a lot of the stage playoff Underdog contests. Now, that's not to say that you necessarily have to stack week 17. It's not necessarily to say that you have to pick one game to stack in week 17, but getting any little bit of correlation can help you when everything comes down to a 1 week sample size, which brings me to my second point. The stage playoffs have a 1 week sample size that a lot of the money is awarded in week 17. Fluky things can happen in the stage playoffs. Last year, Tyreek Hill was one of the best wide receivers in the regular season of best ball, but he was injured in week 15. Also, what happened in week 15? Amari Cooper went off for like 50-plus fantasy points. And so basically what you saw in week 16 was everybody had Amari Cooper and nobody had Tyreek Hill, when in reality, Tyreek Hill was the reason that a lot of the teams were there in the first place. So the stage playoffs can lead to some very fluky results. It's why if you play a lot of these stage playoff contests, it is very wise to build a deep portfolio of a lot of drafts and a lot of different combinations of players. Now, back to cumulative scoring. So cumulative scoring places an emphasis on handcuffing running backs and building out big stacks. What I mean is this. We talked about handcuffing running backs earlier, but if I can guarantee that I have Falcons RB for all 17 weeks, and I think the Falcons are going to be a pretty good team at running the ball, then I'm going to have a pretty good chance that those two guys are going to, or one of those two guys is going to contribute to my lineup week in and week out on a weekly basis, and that will allow me to score a ton of points. What I mean by building out big stacks is I would like to have in cumulative scoring multiple wide receiver options with a quarterback as opposed to one. I think you can get away with one wide receiver, one quarterback stacks in stage playoffs, because if it all comes down to week 17 anyway, then who's to say that that quarterback's not just going to feed one wide receiver and have one wide receiver score a lot of points? That's not the case in all 17 weeks. So if you can build out big stacks where you get 2 and 3, maybe even 4 wide receiver options with a quarterback, then it's very likely that over a 17 game sample size that each one of those receivers can contribute, or there's games where multiple of those receivers can contribute. Whereas, again, in a 1 week sample size, you may only end up needing one. So let's go ahead and talk now about, instead of the macro stage versus cumulative, let's talk about some individual contests and how those can differ. So the first one is Underdog's Eliminator. So this is a very unique format that eliminates a portion of the field each and every week. Think cash game in DFS. If you play daily fantasy on DraftKings or FanDuel for the NFL, this is like a cash game where pretty much the bottom half or the bottom third of the lineup are not going to be making any money. So in this, you want to not embrace volatility. You want to embrace floor. You want to embrace safety. Stacking is not the in vogue strategy, because if you have a quarterback that has a poor outing, then it's very likely that his wide receivers are going to have a poor outing, and your lineup is going to be quite poor for that 1 week, and it just might be poor enough to eliminate you from the competition, hence the name. Now, what that means is you don't need to stack every quarterback. I'd much prefer in the eliminator format 3 quarterback and 3 tight end builds. So that way you can guarantee that you're getting something good out of those 2 positions. But also because a lot of the money is won or lost in the first few weeks, players who have added value in early weeks have a ton of added value in eliminator drafts. Here's what I mean by that. Right now, we have no idea what the injury status of Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns is going to be. It is not likely that he plays in week 1. So Jerome Ford will likely be the Browns starting running back in week 1. Jerome Ford has a ton of added value in the eliminator because he's a guy that can start for you in week 1 instantly. Whereas if you draft, say, Nick Chubb, you're going to need some help to get through the first few weeks because he's not going to be able to contribute to those early weeks, and you may find yourself eliminated before you can even use him. Another example of this is rookies. Rookies tend to see the quote-unquote bye week bump, where they're much better in terms of fantasy production after their bye week in the real season. So if they're not going to be contributing a whole lot before their bye week, then they're not going to help you a whole lot in the eliminator. Now, granted, like with all the other best ball contests, a lot of the money is awarded at the end. So if you can make it to the end, then having those guys can be the absolute optimal strategy. But if they're not going to help you make it to the end and you get eliminated in week 2, then you're done. So it's really a game of give and take. But the guys that have added value in early weeks are guys that are going to have added value in eliminator drafts 10 times out of 10. Now, the sprint is a unique format that I personally love the Underdog did this year. This is a new tournament for them. I love the format. I hate the price point. The price point is $50. If they made this $5, I probably would have max entered it already. But because it's $50, I'm not a big fan. I would rather do 10 $5 drafts than one $50 draft, just me personally. So the sprint is the opposite of the marathon, the cumulative scoring the entire season. The sprint is playoff-only cumulative scoring in weeks 15 through 17. So what that means is there will still be the cutoff after week 14 for teams advancing to the playoffs, and then all the teams that make it to the playoffs are going to be cumulatively scored over week 15, week 16, and week 17, and then the total score for those 3 weeks are going to determine the cash payouts. This format de-emphasizes week 17 only game stacks. Really, you could stack any game week 15 through 17 if you want. And then also a larger sample size of the playoffs lasting over 3 cumulative weeks as opposed to 1 week segments creates a less fluky result, in my opinion. With the Tyreek Hill and Amari Cooper example that we talked about earlier, Amari Cooper can contribute to your team in weeks 15, and then if you don't need him after that, that's fine. But Tyreek Hill, who was not in your lineup in week 15, doesn't hurt you a whole lot because you can still have him in week 16 and week 17. Now, one interesting strategy that looking at the NFL schedules I found is that if you're looking to really maximize your correlation and maximize your game stacks in week 15 through 17, then there are 4 teams who play at least 2 games against each other in the 3 weeks, 15, 16, and 17. Chicago, Green Bay, Minnesota, and Seattle all feature at least 2 games against the 3 of those opponents in those 3 weeks. The only combination that does not play is Chicago and Green Bay. Minnesota plays Chicago, Green Bay, and Seattle. Seattle plays Chicago, Green Bay, and Minnesota. Chicago plays Minnesota and Seattle. Green Bay plays Minnesota and Seattle also. So basically, you can really get just a ton of game stacks if you want to target guys from those 4 teams and hope that those games involving those teams end up going absolutely nuclear and you end up scoring a ton of fantasy points from those players. Now, granted, you don't have to build out your entire team with just these 4 players. In fact, I would say you probably don't want to do that, but you can definitely target this in 1 or 2 stacks, or maybe, get a piece of all of them and just hope to catch the lucky prize, right? Now, the next one and we're going to talk about is the weekly winners contest on Underdog. So weekly winners awards payouts each week to the best lineups. There's no cumulative scoring. There's no playoffs. The best lineups in a given week are going to win. Think about it like daily fantasy on DraftKings and FanDuel and any other website that you might play daily fantasy on. So you want to construct your lineup like a daily fantasy team. You want to build up stacks. You want to build up correlation. You want to get guys that play each other. One kind of added micro strategy that I have not mentioned yet is what I would call division stacking, where you can target guys who play in the same division against each other, because you know that you're going to get 2 games where they're going to be going up against each other. And if you think about the best example of this, think about like the Chiefs and the Chargers. How many times over the last 5 years have we seen those 2 teams play in absolute shootouts against each other, right? So that's a micro strategy that you can use in weekly winners. That way you end up having 2 game stacks among those divisional players that you have. Now, the optimal strategy in weekly winners is to target players with the same bye week, as opposed to in normal best ball, where you want to avoid players with the same bye week. But this is obviously not required. What targeting players with the same bye week would do is it would basically guarantee that you're going to have 16 weeks out of the season where you have a full lineup of players that can end up making your starting lineup, and then 1 week where you're just going to have 0 chance, which would arguably be better than having players with bye weeks all over the place and having 16 non-optimal lineups each and every time you end up looking at your lineup. So basically, that whole concept makes 1 quarterback or 1 tight end builds viable. It also makes 3 running back builds viable, because if you're playing for 1 week, then why not just gamble that 1 quarterback or that 1 tight end is going to have a monster week, or that those 2 or 3 running backs are going to have monster weeks the same week, right? So you can make more fragile builds like that in weekly winners in order to give yourself more kind of slices of the pie at the wide receiver position, and hope that you end up, catching the wide receiver that goes off on each and any given week, because your lineup's going to have to be pretty doggone good to get a payout for any week in weekly winners. Now, we also mentioned how this, you want to construct your lineup like a DFS lineup, right? Well, what do DFS lineups always feature? Stacking. So to me, this places more of an emphasis on stacking your quarterbacks with their pass catchers than any other format, because if that quarterback's going to go off, you're going to need that correlation between the quarterback and the wide receiver if you want to end up winning big money. Now, lastly, let's talk about qualifiers and satellites. So Underdog and DraftKings both offer either qualifier or satellite tournaments, which they're kind of the same concept. Basically, what you do is you enter the qualifier or satellite, and the prize at the end of it, if you win it, is a seat in a larger, more well-known contest. I believe Underdog's current qualifier is for the Scott Fish Bowl. The DraftKings satellite that's available right now is to the King of the Desert DFS contest that they offer year in, year out. But here's the bottom line with these. In these contests, only 1 lineup, or maybe a super small portion of lineups, actually win the qualifying seat. So if you want your 1 lineup to win, then you need to really be unique with your lineup, and you really have to hit on the right combination of players. This would be the time where you might want to go a little off the board with ADP. You might want to try to get really stacky, maybe build some game stacks for the last week, but you want a unique lineup, because basically at the end, if you and a guy have a similar lineup, it's going to come down to those last few players and who can be more unique and who can be more right. So you're really going to want to build out a unique lineup if you are playing a qualifier or a satellite. Personally, these are not really my jam. I've really got a lot of interest and a lot of history with a lot of the other formats on this list. This is not personally my favorite, if I'm being honest. I would rather play for a cash prize than a seat that could win me another cash prize. Now, before we close it out, let's talk about some general thoughts just about drafting on all these sites and what I've seen so far this summer and what I expect to continue for the rest of the summer. So we have seen this trend pretty much every year in best ball, but the larger the dollar entry, the quote unquote sharper the field is. And what I mean by that is when people have more money invested, you're likely getting a portion of people playing those contests that really know what they're doing, or at least think they know what they're doing. They're more likely to consume content on the subject. They're more likely to go purchase rankings or purchase advice on the subject. They're more likely to have more general knowledge because they have more investment on the subject. So the larger the dollar entry, the sharper the field you're going to get. If you're playing a $25 best ball mania on Underdog, you're very likely to get a draft of a lot of guys who have a lot of experience, a lot of guys who will know to go for stacks, will know to go for week 17 game stacks, are not just going to blindly follow the ADP that is there with them on the board. The smaller the dollar amount, the more casual player you're probably looking at. They're not going to care about stacks, and more importantly, they're not going to care about your stacks. I've played smaller money contests because that's pretty much what I would rather do. I would rather, as somebody with a limited budget, play a ton of small dollar contests than a few big dollar contests. And I've seen a ton of times where I've got a few receivers for a team and somebody drafts the quarterback right in front of me, and it makes no sense why they drafted him, but he was the next in ADP on the board, so they felt like they were getting a good ADP value. That's something that you will have to deal with if you play smaller dollar amount contests. And look, one thing I love about the best ball community is a lot of players in the best ball community really don't criticize a whole lot of other best ball players, because really this is such an unsolved game and such a weird game in terms of the randomness that happens over the course of the NFL season. So I really try not to criticize other people's lineups. I will often question it, but hey, at the end of the day, it's your lineup. You got to be unique one way or another. That's one way to be unique, right? If you do something that's totally crazy. So that's just one thing when it comes to dollar amount. I've also found the Underdog is generally sharper than the other sites. Underdog drafters are going to tend to feature those characteristics that I mentioned at the top more so than on DraftKings and drafters. On DraftKings, it's really the wild, wild west. I've seen some crazy entries on DraftKings. And my theory is because DraftKings is primarily a DFS site or even a sports book, the people drafting on DraftKings are just trying it out because they have money on their sports book or their DFS account and they don't really know what best ball is, and they're just going to give it a shot and they're going to try crazy things. And it's not for everybody. If you're somebody who likes to be able to predict how a draft is going to go, then Underdog is probably the place for you. It's probably more predictable. But on DraftKings, you're going to see some wild things like CJ Stroud in the first round is one that I've seen. It is what it is, but, find a way to adapt. And to me, that's part of the fun of drafting, is letting it throw you something that's unexpected and having to see if you can play the mental gymnastics and you can figure out a way to still draft a very viable and solid team from what the rest of your draft lobby gives you. Now, also, Underdog has experimented recently with shorter time clocks. And what I have found is that the shorter the time clock, the chalkier the draft gets. So what I really mean by that is if you're looking at a 10-second clock in a draft room, there's going to be a lot of auto picks because guys aren't going to be able to get their pick in time. I have had it happen to me a few times when I did the 10-second drafts, because if we're being honest, when somebody in front of you auto picks, the amount of lag from it actually processing their pick and telling you that you're on the clock, you really now only have about 6 seconds. And so if you're not fully engaged, I have a 10-month-old daughter now, and sometimes I'm watching her while I'm drafting. If you're not fully engaged and you're really not ready to go, you can miss a pick. And so you end up getting a lot of picks from the top of the board in terms of what's available in ADP because of the amount of auto picks. Personally, the 10 and 15-second drafts are really not for me. I'd really like to have time to process my draft and think it all out. I really also like to have the variability of everybody not auto picking from the top of the board. To me, 20 seconds is a good happy medium, but these Underdog contests that are experimenting with 10 and 15 seconds, I know some people like them, but they're not really for me, in my opinion. Now, let's also talk about this. This is currently the 4th of July that I'm recording this on. The NFL season starts in 2 months. The sooner you draft from right now, the better chance you have at ending with closing line value. And what I mean by that is this. If I draft Jerome Ford right now, and we get a training camp and it turns out Nick Chubb is going to miss 10 weeks with his ACL, then where's Jerome Ford going to go on draft boards? He's going to go way up, right? So I'm getting Jerome Ford in an ADP right now that he might not be available at in August or early September, right? But the contrast is the later you draft, the better picture you have at drafting, right? You know this injury news. You know which rookies are going to be starting on their team, which rookies are going to be making their team. So really, it's kind of a give and take. If you want to run all your drafts in July, go for it. You definitely have a chance at ending with guys or ending with combinations of guys that are not going to be available closer to the start of the season. But if you want to wait till later to draft, then you're going to have more information available to you. You're going to know who's injured, who's not injured, and you're going to be able to have an accurate picture of what you're drafting and hope that you're going to be able to predict it better than the others. So to me, that's another interesting give and take with Underdog. Personally, I've talked to a lot of my friends about this, and they all want to wait as late as possible so that way they don't draft somebody that gets injured. But I've tried to make the argument to them hey, if I run 10 drafts and I only draft a player in one of those entries and that guy gets hurt, then I have 9 entries where I don't have that guy, and I've got increased value in those 9 entries because I don't have the guy that ends up getting hurt on those 9 teams. That's the argument that I've tried to make. But I think that a lot of people will still choose to draft later because you do have a more accurate, more even picture when it comes to what you're drafting. All right, so that does it for the Underdog of Best Ball contest selection and strategy show. So we went over every type of contest and all the different types of strategies that you will need to know in order to draft on Underdog, DraftKings, Drafters, or even FanDuel this year. Now, one last thing I do want to mention, I mentioned this at the top, but if you need anything from me, I've got all the promo codes, signupexpert.com/Mike'sPicks. I've also got some in the description. So if you want to sign up for any of these sites, maybe you haven't tried one yet, use the description, use SignUpExpert, or reach out to me directly on Twitter. I'd be more than happy to just send you a direct link or send you the promo code, whatever. But I'm an open book. So if you want more information from me on any of this, reach out to me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. Also, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as the audio. We've done some private best ball leagues in the Fantasy Corner Discord, but once the regular season starts up for college football, NFL, college basketball, I'm going to be in there almost on a daily basis talking about DFS plays and all these sports, talking about who I like, who I don't like, with a lot of other people who are very smart and have won some money doing this. So if you want to get in on that discussion, join it now. And then also, I do have some tools on my Patreon, patreon.com/moneypicks to help with best ball. I have the stacking guide, which has every team's opponent in the best ball playoffs, as well as their projected depth chart at wide receiver and where you can draft them at. So if you're looking to build out stacks, you can very easily in one tab have everything you need to know about building out a tab for a certain team. Excuse me. I'm also going to have my rankings up before the summer is over as well. And then on my Patreon, once the season starts, you will get weekly articles with my DFS scores on DraftKings and FanDuel for the NFL, college football, and college basketball. All right, so hopefully this episode was able to help you guys out a little bit. If I was able to help you out in any way, make sure you hit the like button on YouTube, rate and review the audio. Go ahead and check out the rest of the best ball content that is on the playlist on YouTube if you have not already. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. That way you can be with us for the rest of best ball summer, as well as we start the regular season in NFL and college football, and as we wrap up the rest of the PGA Tour season as well, which has a major in 2 weeks, so you can join us for that. All right, but that's going to do it for this episode, guys. Like I said, hopefully I was able to help you out a little bit, kind of help you wrap your head around all the different contests that are available to you in best ball and which ones might be the best for you and how you can be the best at them. Hopefully I was able to help you guys out a lot. Go win some money this year playing best ball. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.